I'm Paul Deloria for the Maui Community Investigation. I'm here today with one of my team members, Bruce Douglas, and also we have Tim Stokes with us, a special guest who will be really going in and explaining some of the forensics that we're dealing with here in this fire. And we'll be going over slides, and Tim will be commenting on all the different slides. But before we start, Tim, could you give a little bit of your background and your experience that you've had?
I've worked in three different fire capacities, or four different fire capacities in my life. It started at Catalina Island. I was a volunteer firefighter out there. I came to Kauai, got on the base, was a federal firefighter at PMRF, and then joined the county here and made it to captain, Honolulu, as I retired 2 years ago. And I also worked for Northrop Grumman, doing RMS work for the military for about 18 and a half years, top secret clearance. And some of our duties overlapped into that realm as well.
Great. How many years does that encompass, Tim, in terms of your fire experience?
Let's see, about 30 years.
Fantastic. So we look forward to you just making comments on our different slides that we have with all that experience that you have. So Tim, during the day of August 8th, there were a lot of fires that were reported. And you can see some of them here that are on this map. Certainly this is Lahaina. And then as we go here, we have our Kula fires. We have a Kihei fire. We have one in Kahului. We also had one in Wailuku. And as I looked at all the different fire reports for that day on August 8th, the fire department reported 46 different incidences. And could you, Tim, tell us a little bit about what it means when they report a fire incident, and is it normal to have as many as 46 different fires? Yes, there was a lot of high winds that day, but what's your experience, your 30-year experience tell you in terms of this being normal or not normal?
Okay, this is normal isn't, I don't know if that's the best word for it. NIMFERS is a national incident reporting system, and as far as I know, all the fire departments in the U.S. use it and send in their data from all their incidents, not just fire. All incidents go into this database, and they use that for various purposes. So generally, once a fire starts at an address or an area on an island, it runs that same continuous incident number until that fire's closed out. So it would be called extinguished. So once you call the fire extinguished, that would end that incident. And now if it rekindled, you would start a new incident number. But if you put the fire under control, but didn't call it extinguished, and it rekindled, then that would be a continuation of that same fire. So that's kind of like the delineation line between when you start a new incident number and not. So it could be geographic location. It could be some guys will break it off at a certain time at night, even though we continue ours on. Like, so if we go to 3-day brush fire, that 3-day brush fire will continue on that same incident on our island, on our county. Now, how they do it, I'm not sure, but it should be pretty much a national standard because this is a national database. So yeah, 46 fires in one day. I would say that's well above average. Probably that's more like a state average than an island average or a county average, but that's a lot. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen, you know? So we have days on our island when we have arsonists that go around and they light up a bunch of fires, and we'll have 15 incident numbers from someone going around the island lighting fires. So it's not, I've never had 46, but.
So in terms of the incident, this was number 12446, and this is where it initially started. They say it was an electrical fire that began with the high winds, and that was the brush fire that happened at 6:35. That's what they have the incident number as. And they battled the fire till 10 o'clock in the morning when they felt like it was fairly well extinguished. But then at 3:55, then it flared up again in the same area. So this whole so first of all, I guess the first question is having these types of electrical fires where we have telephone poles down, is that an often occurrence in terms of brush fires?
Not generally, unless it's allowed to burn for a long time with really bad access where you can't get to it to stop the fire. You know, usually the power lines don't come down. They usually come down more from either a tree, a high winds in a tree, or a car accident brings them down a lot, believe it or not. Cars hit them all the time and it'll take them down. But generally, they don't generally come down. A high wind could force that. But like I say, usually you're going to get there and try to get it put out, at least around those major infrastructures. Also, the power lines have, they can stop power through the transmission of the power through the lines. And there's also a hard fuse. It's a drop. It's a big iron bar looking thing that's on the side of the telephone poles. You'll see them when you're driving down the street. And when one of these is compromised or whatever, it's supposed to drop like a fuse and stop the power from that end. Although it may or may not be de-energized based on if it's a dead end or a loop where the power is coming back from another side. And then you've got solar considerations too. If there's solar input, that sometimes are not, they're independent of that as far as the structures go.
I see. So this initial brush fire that occurred, then they later declared it was extinguished, but then in the same area it was rekindled, and it really did take off. But now the amount of brush that was there, if you look, you can see that, I mean, it's up to 4 feet high, real dry. There's a lot of grass that is not really thick, but then we have a little bit of shrubs in there also. Is that enough to do this type of light up that we have to create this level of destruction that we
saw? The fuel acts like a fuse. If you think it like a fuse, so you can have a very small fuse that lights off a big firecracker or bomb, right? The little fuse is small and it gets the fire to go where it needs to go. So typically that's a very light brush load. Although it can generate a lot of heat, it usually burns out quick and travels fast. These type of fires tend to travel really quickly because it's light brush. It doesn't take very long to catch on fire, and it's preheated, to the point where it's ready to go. So as soon as the fire catches up, it ignites and it goes, and it can travel and run very quickly. Especially, like I said, uphill or if it's being wind driven. So the speed in which it moves is going to be defined on the humidity, the moisture content in the fuels, the lateral movement of heat that's pre-igniting so that the fire can travel faster as it goes. So that's really not conclusive in and of itself, because you could start a house fire with just a simple match. So it doesn't take much in the right conditions, or the wrong conditions, I should say. So that's really not something that's gonna that alarms me, that the town caught on fire because of a little brush fire. That kind of happens. We call it urban interface. And there's actually a statewide plan called Firewise. I don't know if it's still active, but I know there was a gal named Denise Laytonton used to go to all the islands. And what it basically does is it tries to mitigate the chance of a wildland fire catching structures on fire. And so they call that an urban interface fire, when a wildland fire interfaces an urban area.
Now, when you have those interfaces, do they usually recommend some type of a fire break?
Yes, well, it's always recommended, but then unlike some places, not so much as Hawaii, it becomes down to who owns the property, and it's an expense, and who's going to keep up on it. We've come up with some pretty creative ways on Kauai to try to mitigate that, and they seem to work in some areas. So that's something we could discuss,
Well, just briefly, what would be some of the legislation or ordinances that were passed that would support that type of brush mitigation?
Well, I'm aware of 2 different issues. And so I know in California, and I'm not trying to make Hawaii like California, believe me, that'd be the last thing in my mind. But in California, what they do is they'll go by these big open rural agricultural areas. Maybe there's cattle, sheep, whatever on them. I don't know. And if they're not being grazed down to comply with their ordinance of having a cleared area 100 yards or 100 feet or whatever it is from a fence line, then they'll send crews out to go out and actually do it and send you a bill. So that's kind of the hard way of doing it. That's not the friendly way of doing it. On Kauai, what in a certain area, we've had ongoing urban interface fires down in the south side. And what we've done is set up community gardens along those corridors. And so the community garden actually allows people to go and have a little plot, and they garden it and they grow vegetables, and it's usually green because they're watering it and they're weeding it and taking care of it. And it creates a nice little opportunity for the community to have a garden. And it also creates a nice little green zone between the possible fire and the structures we're trying to prevent from burning. And that's kind of a cool idea. It does take a little organization and whatnot, but it's a lot less of an impact financially on either the county or the landowner to constantly mow it. So
That's great. That's wonderful. So let's continue on in terms of the fire right now. But I think that's something that we should look at here in Maui County, and we're trying to do something along that line with brush mitigation. There were a lot of infrastructure failures that we were very concerned about. And again, how normal is this in a fire incident? There were no cell service, at least starting that day before, in the whole Lahaina area. It seemed to have been blocked out, especially in some areas where they couldn't call in or call out at all. There was no electricity starting at 3 a.m. in some areas in Lahaina on the 8th. That was well before that first fire, that first brush fire occurred. And there are some actual cell phones where people could call the mainland, but they couldn't call any local phones. So again, something very peculiar. And then another infrastructure failure was the water. And again, how common is it for hydrants to be totally dry, or to have low pressure, or and some of the hydrants actually had some water for a little period of time. And then also this other one that, again, many of us are still scratching our head about, police directing traffic for escape. So could you just go through this with us, Tim, and look at, first of all, the cell phones? And is that something that you've seen before, where it was the day before the cell phones went out?
Generally, no. I mean, that I don't run the cell phone towers and whatnot in their industry. They do go out from time to time, whether it's related or a coincidence. You know, there's too many coincidences to me in this fire to where I'm skeptical of more than I normally would be. Just saying that, to be honest with you, but I try to stay impartial and not biased. But there's a lot of discrepancies and weird things that happened that day or in that time frame. First of all, with the electricity, what you just said came to mind. The very first picture you show is that first power line that fell and hit the ground and supposedly started this whole ignition process and this big fire catastrophe. And my question is, well, if the power was out, then how did that power line transmit any power to start the fire? And if it was hot, then why was the power out down the line, right? Like, who's making those decisions? Was that done by, their power company, or was that done by, I'm not sure. It just doesn't make sense to me why that one was left on to start a fire and yet the other ones were turned off. I mean, it doesn't really, there's a discrepancy there that I would look into. That's all I'm saying. And then a cell phone, I'm not really sure. We have parts on our island. We have absolutely no cell phone coverage, and our 800 radio system sometimes barely works. You have to go run to a certain point or a weird place, and that's just standard. And then the other thing that happens with cell phones is a lot of times when there's a catastrophe, we remember the missile crisis thing that we had a little while back, where the missile was coming, everybody's on their cell phone. So now the cell phone system got its capacity was exceeded basically, and you couldn't use it even if it was working. It was a mess. So those are some of the things happen during an emergency with cell phones, that communication gets taxed, and sometimes it's not dependable. But way out in front like that, that's just something I would look into as well. Hydrants. Now that's something that we deal with constantly. We have a pretty good relationship with our water department on our island, and they're really good about calling up and telling us that we have a down hydrant. That means a hydrant that's out of service, and then we'll make notation of it so everybody knows. And then we, like, as a captain, my job is to, do my job. And so I always, and this is just how I did my job, I always teach my operators and my firefighters that when we don't depend on the DMT and the MDT in your car, the mobile data transmitting, it's like a TV screen in your car that you can get all this information off of. And I'd make them actually look at hard copy as they ran out the door, and we had a map on our wall, and we'd have special notes on it and Post-its and stuff if there was something in that applied to an address that we were responding to. And we'd always look for the primary hydrant and then the secondary hydrant. In case that hydrant was out, we had plan B. And also if we hooked up to that hydrant and we had our second engine company coming in, I could direct them to that second hydrant that we'd already chosen. And that way we didn't cross our hoses where they're running over our active charged hoses when we're fighting the fire. We could vector them in down a different street around the back way, so they had access to that second hydrant. So that's all part of fire mitigation and response planning. And you have to just kind of always have that in your head, you know, that this is what I'm trying to do. It's not always just there's the hydrant and there's the fire. You've got a team of guys coming behind you, a lot of support, and they're going to need water supply as well. And then in our districts, every year we go out and we test our hydrants. So we have a pretty good data pool of what hydrants are weak, what hydrants are strong. And a lot of people don't even understand that a normal fire hydrant that you see on the street, you know, one with the large diameter and the small diameter hookup. Well, on our island, we have a lot of standpipes. So it's a pipe coming out of the ground with a single small diameter hookup, and those don't put out fires once they're really going. I mean, that's really hard to put out a full burning house fire, let alone a town on a standpipe. And I'm not sure what the water supply there was, if they were all hydrants or if there were some standpipes. But that's another consideration that we have to take into effect when we're rolling up on an address. Sometimes I'll stretch in farther to get a real hydrant instead of picking up a standpipe, so I got more volume of water available to me. Also the pump, the engines themselves suck water. They actually pull water. So, I mean, you can literally pull a hydrant out of the ground if you suck hard enough. You know, if you're pulling, you can draft, they call it, and you're pulling water from that in that pumping system. So if you're getting a few pounds of water and a little trickle, you can actually increase that up to a little point. But then when that fails, that's it. And it's, you know, you start cavitating and whatnot, and you'll start having problems with your pump, and you can mess up your engine pretty bad. So that's stuff we always play in a balancing act. Water coming in, water going out. As far as water being turned off or turned on, we're always notified if it's done by the water department. Now, if an automobile hits something, or there's a landslide or something of that nature that happens to a hydrant, sometimes we're the first to find out. So that's where we always try to have plan B in place.
So you're saying that it's one of the things that we should look at is the communication dynamics between those in control of the water and the fire department itself, and to see if that was maintained, because I hear that that's a real important element that you maintained.
And then on that subject, so I would call it the hierarchy of response, or when we're trained as firefighters, we're trained that my life is most important. So I need to take care of myself. And then my next most important factor is my crew. I make sure they're okay. So it's me, my crew, and then it's the public. So life comes first. Then after that, we have property. Property comes second. So life always trumps property. And then after that, we got the environment. We want to take care of the environment best we can, but we always take life, property, then the environment. That's the way we're trained in our hierarchy of response. So that means I'm going to put all my energy into saving a life way before I'm going to go and save the house, right? So life comes first. I want to get the people out of the house, or whatever I need to do, whatever situation it is. I'm going to take care of life, and then property, and then the environment. And with that said, that's the way we respond. And what's interesting to me is they had a lot of resources doing things that they could arguably say, oh, we were keeping people from going a way that could have put them in harm or whatever. But, you know, and it's easy to armchair quarterback. I wasn't there. I wasn't getting orders from above. I don't know the situation. But when I look at it, I'm looking at a lot of resources that were done directing traffic and stuff. And I felt I would be like wanting to get those resources actually on helping people, getting them out, warning them, whatever it was. And I found that a little strange, that I thought they were placing a higher value on and not putting all the resources just on immediate life safety, because there was people immediately in danger, and they were looking at something that might happen if they didn't do this over here, to where more people could get in harm's way, if that's the way they're trying to justify it. But I thought it was, to me, I didn't agree with that. I would have had anybody possible warning, grabbing people, whatever they could be done to get these people out of immediate harm's way. So I take the immediate danger first, and then I lessen it as it gets, I got more time to deal with those problems. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? So you break down what's the worst thing happening right now, and is there anything I can do about that, right? And so that's my thought process. That's how I go after it. And then we have what we call a CAN report. If you're using, whatever system you use, basically it's you roll up, you've got your conditions, your actions, and your needs. So this is what I got, this is what I'm doing, and this is what I need. And you send that up the pipeline. So if you can get those audio tapes from the 911 logs, all that should be in there. And it's going to give you timestamps, who said what to who, locations, and the prioritization of their resources.
So Tim, we did make a request for that, especially for the numbers that we got for this fire. The big fire is number 12492. That's the incident report, and we're trying to get some specifics on that. Going just one more thing up in terms of the infrastructure was the really incredible warning system that we have that was not utilized. Again, if you had a large fire that was along the coastline and it wasn't a tsunami coming in, would those fire alarms go off in Kauai?
That's a what if question, because it depends who's running the show that particular day and their hands are on the button and who's making what decisions. But I found that to be very strange because it's actually an emergency alert system. It's not just a tsunami warning. It's used for, it could be used for many different things. I believe that's what, we're all trained on. It generally means tsunami. So that's the first thing that people come to mind, or a test, but they go off every month. And so people hear them. And if it's not, I don't know what day they do theirs, but if it's out of that realm, then without being announced, then people are going to come probably outside of their house and it is going to alert them to something wrong. But as a reasonable person, a human being, if you see the fire coming from up there, I doubt it's going to make me run away from the ocean and run into the fire. I mean, I found that to be a little bit, that's the excuse they're going with, or that's their plan. That's the way they came up with their reasoning. But I think just warning people and people being fairly smart, most animals and humans have a natural fear of fire. I think they're not going to run into the fire. They're going to try to get away from it, as many tried and failed, unfortunately. But I don't think because you sound an alarm that people are going to get out of their house and run directly into a fire because they think a tsunami's coming. I find that a little bit far-fetched, but whatever,
So let's continue on this. The fire spread very rapidly. The winds were somewhere around anywhere from 60, some report around 80 miles an hour. And it really did engulf the whole area. I guess when you look at the second fire at 355, starting way up on the upper part of, where the bypass is, going all the way down and then engulfing all the way to Front Street by 5:30 p.m. So that was quite a distance to move. But again, the winds were very high. So would you say that is somewhat normal, or in terms of the scope and breadth of the fire itself, does that seem like another strange anomaly?
So there's some stuff just right in this picture. You're showing me this picture. And if you didn't tell me anything about this, I would never tell you that this has 80-mile-an-hour winds right here. Now, the ocean does look a little windblown and a little rough, but I've never been in 80-mile-an-hour winds. So that's a lie. I've been in 75-mile-an-hour winds. I've been in a gale force hurricane up in Alaska, and you can barely stand up. I mean, it really wants to knock you over. You got to lean into it. And I'm looking at these palm trees and they're fairly vertical and they might be getting blown around a little bit, but it doesn't look like 80-mile-an-hour winds. Plus those plumages, they would be way more laterally slanted. They'd be, instead of coming up at like a 70 or 80 degree angle, they'd be laid down a lot more and they'd be pushed sideways a lot more. Just looking at this picture, I don't think that looks like 80-an-hour winds. That looks like maybe 30-mile-an-hour winds or 40-mile-an-hour winds. I don't know. I'm just guessing, but it doesn't look like 80. 80 is like the fire actually, balls of fire will blow across the ground and roll. And I've seen that down at like 35 and 40 miles an hour. I've seen fire getting blown like tumbleweeds across the ground. The other thing about fire that's interesting, and they use this, the guys that are really good, and you should probably, the guys in prevention, they go to special training that the average firefighter doesn't necessarily go through. We go through prevention training, but they go to a higher level. And there's what they call coning. And so when a fire starts, if you're up in the sky looking straight down, and depending on the fuel load, obviously, and that would include fire breaks, and fire breaks in our situation, there'd be a lot of roads, right? And obviously the ocean, but the roads will, that's a line where fuel stops and starts, and it can jump over a road and get the fuel on the other side if the road's narrow enough, or the fire's big enough, or the fuel's, they're in the right way. So one thing is, if you take an open grass field and you start a fire in the center of it, and whichever way that wind's blowing, that fire has to constantly feed itself. So it's looking for new fuel. So as it burns, it creates a cone, it cones out. So the head of the fire is going to get wider and wider and wider as it goes. Now, the more wind you have, the more longer that coning is going to be. If you had absolutely no wind and you started a fire in the middle of a field, in theory, it should just burn out like a complete circle, right? From the ground looking down, it's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger. If it's wind driven, it's going to cone out like a baseball bat. And the more extreme the wind, the longer that cone's going to be. Now, that also works vertically. When you look at burning up a building on the side, if it started at the bottom of a 3-story building, as it burns up, it's going to get wider and wider and wider and cone out as it goes up, searching for fuel, oxygen, whatnot. So you've got, horizontal coning, and you got vertical coning. And these are other indicators where you can look and see how the fire was spreading. And if you find open areas that it's not coning, but yet it looks more like a line, a delineated line, then that's going to show that something that's like an abnormality that you're going to look at, because generally it's going to search for fuel and feed itself to keep burning.
Great. So again, it was very rapid. So we had gusty winds on August 7th, and we had this white haze that again was something that no one really had seen before here on the island. And it was reported on Molokai also. People saw the white haze coming and coating stuff. That was the day before. And then approximately then we had 12:30 a.m. we had that fire in Kula that broke out. And then we had that 6:40 a.m. fire then with the down power line, as they said that was the cause. And then by 10 it was contained. 3:30 the fire started in the same area, and by 5:30 then people were jumping into the water. And you can see the spread in terms of the level of damage, that was done. You can see here all the green is area that is untouched, that seemed everything is intact here. And notice even in here, there are areas of green. In other words, that these are buildings that survived the fire. And I guess my first question is, in terms of how rapidly it spread from all the way up here and totally engulfed and started to go all the way to Front Street here by 5:30. So the speed of the fire, again, and then also just questions why things like this occurred, where you have destruction all around, especially if it's wind driven, and yet we have something that survives right at the center. And you can see this here, how far the destruction was. And yet, and again, it was a rapid moving fire. And is this something that you've ever seen before, Tim?
Well, nature's weird, like after the hurricane, I saw brand new houses, brand new style houses with modern construction, completely leveled on the ground, and then a Hawaiian shack right next to it that stood during a hurricane. So that's kind of a weird with Mother Nature. But what's weird about your pictures are interesting, is that if they're claiming there was 80-mile-an-hour winds pushing that fire sideways, and you've got a house that burned right next to it on the upwind side, it's very, very unusual that there's not some fire damage to that house. So if they have asphalt shingles, those asphalt shingles should be melted and, like literally dripping. Depending on the building construction of that structure, what it was made out of, obviously stucco is going to be a little bit better than your normal wood structure or something like that, cementatious, that's going to be harder to ignite. But even with superheating, when you get into cementatious stuff, the metal expands underneath it and you get a lot of cracking and spalling. And I don't have the figures in the top of my head, but they'll tell you a piece of rebar, number 4 rebar, heated up to a certain degree, will expand this much. And it usually blows out all the concrete and spalds it. if it's continuously hot enough to heat up that steel, because it expands at a different ratio than the concrete or the underlying materials. Now, that picture there, it was completely like a horseshoe, and it looks like the fire was on the upwind side of it. So for that house to be white and not all brown and black and melted, or even fractured windows, because at a certain point the windows will blow out, and that is unusual, very unusual, that happened. But I don't know the construction of that house, what it, it might be smart panel hardy board. I mean, it could be a cementatious siding and it looks like a metal roof, so that's going to stop it from igniting as readily as the other materials. So that's an individual by individual. But the way the fire just followed the street line right there, and then you can see along the front where it kind of started to arc in along that wall and burn back around it before it decided to go out for whatever reason. But when you're talking about super high wind fires, anything downwind of that fire should have some serious fire and heat damage. And that fire that away, and I can't see the other side of the house to see if there's charring on the other side, but I would expect the other side of the house to be completely charred in that fire, because it's only one little small street right across from that big lot that burned on the other side. So those are unusual things. When I see that, it's unusual.
And again, you can see this in terms of the destruction around these buildings here, and then again, these were standing in.
And then when you show photos like that, it would be good, because I know Maui well. I worked in Lahaina for quite a while, so I understand it pretty well. Not as good as you guys do, but when you show a picture, it'd be good to put an arrow showing the wind, like the wind direction, which way the wind's coming, because then it gives you a reference point on to where the damage should or shouldn't be, or how it should have spread or not spread. And that's going to be a good indicator when you show photos. And
Great.
then also on your earlier slide, it showed the fire was contained at 10 something in the morning. Make sure you get the right terminology from the reports, if it was extinguished or contained. So containment does not mean extinguished, and that shouldn't generate a new incident number for the ongoing fire, because that fire is not officially been put out yet, and it's still an ongoing. It's not closed out. Contained is not extinguished, and there's a big difference between those two words.
Yeah, and they did close it out, and they felt that it was extinguished when we talked to the fireman over there in Lahaina.
Well, when they feel it, that's one thing, but literally on the radio, if I'm on a fire, I'll say, "Oh, fire's under control." And then I'll say fire's under control. And usually that is a sign that means that we have enough resources to manage what we're dealing with right here, where in this case, that's not going to be, because that original fire was a smaller little brush fire, and it may have been contained. So you can't apply it to this whole town on fire. But once I call the fire extinguished, that's a big difference. You don't walk away from it, basically. For all practical purposes, you either leave someone there watching it, or you go and get, swap out guys. You guys will go back and get lunch, whatever, come back, whatever they're going to do. But it's not like, okay, we had it almost out and that was good enough and we left. I mean, I've never heard of that. I'm not intentionally.
Yeah.
We do have, and I wanted to bring this up, we talked about it a little bit earlier. Now in Hawaii, we have a high percentage of rekindles. We do have high humidity, which helps with materials that ignite. It takes a little longer maybe to ignite them, because they have a little more inherent humidity in them and moisture content. But in Hawaii, we have a lot of organics in our soil, duff and loam, and we have root structures that are shallow. And so what can happen is you can have a brush fire, and then you'll put it out and you'll literally say it's extinguished. I mean, there's no more smoke coming off the ground. You knocked out all the hot rocks. There's no steam coming off them. You think it's out, and you're right in you're thinking that. And then it can burn underground slowly and smolder. And then if you get some high winds coming off that, it increases the oxygen down in the soil. It'll actually fuel it with a little more oxygen, and just like blowing on a spark, you can get it to come back to a flame. And that happens naturally in Hawaii quite a bit. So rekindling is something that we deal with all the time, not as much on, structures, but in wildland fighting. So it's real important to get down good penetration. We used additives in our water so that we reduce the surface tension, and we get better penetration into the fuels so they don't rekindle. And you can find out if they were using any additives, or wet water, or different types of agents that they'll add to the water, to foams and whatnot, to see if they used those in that fire to help mitigate rekindle.
Great, great. I know that we were talking to some of the firemen there, and they said that there's some fires that rekindle a month after the fire had happened. So
That can happen if there's a substantial dead tree under the ground or something big that allows it just to keep burning under the ground for a while. That's a long time. And Hawaii, depending on which side of the island you're on, like if you're on, my island, you're on the North Shore, it's probably going to rain within that month and probably put it out with natural, extinguishment. If you get a good rain, that'll take care of that. But if you're on the dry side and you're not getting a lot of rain, that spark could stay underground and burn for some time. So,
Right.
I don't rule anything out when it comes to rekindles. They're shameful in the fire department. When you put out a fire and the other guy's got to go back out and put out your fire, it's kind of a shame thing, right? So we try real hard not to do that.
Thanks for that explanation, because again, that's an interesting phenomenon, how things can rekindle like that. One of the other interesting anomalies that we looked at was that some of these boats that burned were actually about a half a mile or at least a quarter of a mile offshore. And and you can see some of the destruction of some of the boats that were offshore, and they were pretty intense in terms of the level of destruction that occurred to these boats. Is this a common thing? Again, there were sparks flying, certainly a lot of sparks flying,
So
especially on Front Street going out offshore.
correct. And I've seen many of the local videos, people's cell phones, with them in the water and what was going on. It looked incredibly horrible. And so this is another one. Typically, no, I would say it's don't you think it's unusual that a boat that's 100 yards offshore or 50 yards offshore gets completely burned down, and yet the house with the fire right across the street from it, only 40, 50, 60 feet away or 100 feet away, stand with no damage at all. So that's something that raises a question, but also you don't know. All it takes is one ember to go fly out on that boat and land in a spot where it can take hold and start a fire. So could it happen? Yes, it could happen. But I find it irregular that a boat that far offshore caught on fire and burned, and the house right across the street didn't even have a burn mark on it. That's something that just doesn't make sense, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Yep. Good. So let's continue in some of these anomalies. If you look at the level of destruction that we're facing here in Lahaina, and then you look at the number of trees that are still standing, and how the buildings are reduced to white ash, is this something that you've seen before in fires of this intensity?
First of all, very few people on Earth get to live through a fire of this intensity. I mean, you look at the fuel load that was going on here. One house puts off radiant heat like crazy. A whole city block or a whole town block putting off radiant heat, collective with how many houses in that block. I mean, that's something very few, even seasoned firefighters, get a chance to experience. The most buildings I've ever lost in a fire was, I think, 5 or 7 structures we lost in a bad one on Kauai, in a neighborhood much like this, the dry side of the island. And it didn't happen exactly like this did. It was a slower chain effect, and it was just down to resources, basically limited resources and extreme winds. But our winds were even close to what these winds were, and they were very effective in doing what they needed to do to take out some neighborhoods. The thing that makes me wonder about things is, just the melting points of different substances and materials. Like, we all talk about the aluminum and we talk about glass. Glass doesn't melt easy, and it takes sustained heat, not just little intervals of heat. And so when a fire burns, what it's doing is doing a chemical chain reaction, right? So you've got fuel, oxygen, and heat, and a chemical chain reaction. That's what takes place in a fire as far as, science. And certain things take a longer time and are sustained heat. And so what generally would happen in a brush fire is your fuel load, especially in this light fuel, wouldn't have the sustained heat, because you're going to burn out that fuel way before it can get to that temperature, or it can be long enough to allow that radiant heat to affect those materials in such an impactful way. So you're looking at time and fuel and heat, basically these different situations here. It's really strange to me that you see trees with still green fronds on them and stuff, even though they who knows what the inside's looking like. And then, I've been to just single apartment fires where every tree around it, one half of the tree looked like you just hit it with a torch, literally, and you basically did. And so it's kind of interesting if we're having this super high winds with this heat being blown sideways so radically that you would have any green, anything that's left. But like I say, Mother Nature's weird, and even in a hurricane, there's little pockets that don't get vortexed on, and things kind of somehow survive. And but generally, when you look at this, it doesn't look right. It just looks like there was way too much left where it was left, and way too much destroyed where it was destroyed. And then the places where things were destroyed, there's all of a sudden something sitting there that isn't destroyed, and you're like, wow, how did that survive that without even any kind of, didn't look like there's any outward damage when you look at it. And it just doesn't really follow suit in my mind. It's very questionable.
Yeah. And as we look at those trees that, now here's one with a tree with leaves on it. But as you go and look further down, you can see how it's hollowed out at the bottom of the tree. Now, certainly there are pukas and little crevices where something could lodge, and it could go up into, I guess, the inside of a tree. But we saw several of these types of incidences with the trees, the way they were burnt from more the inside and having the bark and leaves remain. So is that something you've seen before, Tim?
Not in this circumstance. Like, I've seen the inside of the trees burn, and it's usually people down at the beach, like the homelessy kind of people, or the whatever you want to call them. I'm not, and they're down at the beach, and they're camping on the beach or whatever they're doing, and they start a fire next to a tree. It's like their little shelter, and they leave it burn, and it burns up the inside of an ironwood tree down at the beach. And that happens all the time for us over here. But on this picture here, I see a lot of unburned fuel right next to it. Now, I don't know if this.
No, that brush was put there after, because
Okay.
we came there. This was taken several days after the fire itself, and they had started clearing a little bit.
Yeah, but it even looks like there's no. I can't really see it really great in the picture, but it looks like there's a lot of unburned fuel besides that brush.
That's right.
On the ground around it, right? So
that's right, all along here.
It almost, in this instance, because of the coning thing we were talking about, it almost looks like the tree is what started the ground on fire. Like, it's burning out from the tree, and like it didn't burn from the ground to the tree. Like I'm seeing, like, right on the right hand side where that horizontal fresh brush that you said was put in there, but behind it there's smaller brush. It looks like unburnt fuel right there, and then on the opposite side as well.
Yeah, right here.
Yes, well, even off to the right, yeah, up there, and then across on the left side in that same line. So you're like, well, that tree that's a big fuel load, right? That's a lot of fuel, and it's dense, and it's weird that something like that, but then the ground doesn't even have any burn on it right there. It's like, did the tree catch the grass on fire? Did the grass catch the tree on fire? I'm not sure, but throwing that unburnt bush in there kind of throws you off. It kind of.
Yeah,
it'd be better if that wasn't in there, so you could actually see the whole footprint around it to see how it fused to that tree. And then you got telephone poles right in the background, and they don't look like they got a burn mark on them.
No,
so
they didn't. They were perfectly fine. And this is one of the pictures that Bruce took in terms of the burn marks here. Bruce, you want to explain a little bit? You're on mute, Bruce.
I'm going to show a screenshot I'd like to show that shows more than this one. Okay, I'll come to that later.
Okay, so we can come to that, but why don't you just explain this little piece here in terms of what you've.
Yeah, well, this is where you see the inside of the tree burnt, and we don't know if this was hollow to begin with or the fire hollowed it out in this particular view, but we see the inside of the tree burnt, but the bark on the outside still intact.
Yeah, that's the question you just said is exactly the question in my mind. So what was done prior to the fire, and what was the state of that tree prior to the fire? And these are all things that are going to be hard to really figure out. But from what I understand, looking at some of these other people that are claiming like dues and this stuff, that if they are using that the moisture content should be drastically reduced if the center of that tree was on fire. If you cut up farther into the tree, a little higher where the fire didn't actually touch, and take a moisture gauge, little moisture meter, which we use in the wood shop all the time. And you just take the moisture, find a big log on the ground that was compromised by fire on the bottom or whatever, maybe take a chainsaw, cut it down in the middle where and where it's not been dehydrated by the elements, and then take your moisture gauge and see if you have less moisture in the center of the tree than the outside of the tree, because in a normal fire, the outside of the tree would be what caught on fire first, and she would have a lower moisture content on the outside of the material than on the inside. But if you have the opposite, it's going to show that that's not normal, right? Does that make sense? Right.
Yeah.
So the outside of the tree would be the one that was exposed to sun, heat from the fire and whatnot. And so it should be losing its moisture more than the inside. In this case, it looks like the opposite was true.
Yeah. And so we can go back to trees a little later on, but let's look at some of the vehicles and some of the strangeness of how the actual different cars were affected. Notice how this is totally fried right here along the very back. And then there's almost a straight line where this is pretty much disintegrated.
Yeah.
And then kind of stops here. But you can see the line and how this telephone pole is perfectly fine with the transformers still there. And we have the trees still doing fine. The telephone lines are still up, but to have this kind of be incinerated the way it is, just the front part of the car, could you comment on that, Tim?
So generally your hydrocarbons, cars are pretty nasty, right? First of all, they're full of plastics and stuff. That's really bad smoke. Most people, are overcome by the toxic smoke and fumes before the fire in these situations. Thank God. And so in the front, you've got the engine and you've got your oils, and you got a fuel tank in the car. And most of the times they don't blow up like the movies. They'll make a little pop at best. And as far as fuel goes, if the fuel is compromised, it'll run out on the ground and cause some different trailings and stuff. If it's not compromised, then and the vapors, like I said, vapors are what burn. So an empty fuel tank will be more inept to explode, where a full fuel tank would be more inept to burn. As far as the way these cars burn, it does look funny that how one part of the car is completely looks like powder almost, and where the materials have been completely destroyed and converted into something else than the steel or whatever they were made out of, the alloy. And then you see another part of a car that's over there that's partially got caught on fire, which is a weird part for a car to catch on fire, is in the back like that, because there's really nothing back there. Usually the fuel tank's up a little more forward, but like I say, I'm not an expert on that car, and I don't even know what kind of car it is. They build them all a little different, but it's weird that the back of that car is what chose to catch on fire instead of the other parts of the car. And that might have been just charring from the radiant heat from that primary car that was ignited. So, it's really hard to tell. Cars are difficult because you want to really look at with vehicles is the type of materials in the vehicle and the different temperatures that they melt. And that's going to tell you a lot more than a bunch of pictures of burnt cars. But then it is weird. You'll see a car that's just perfectly fine sitting right there. And then we all talked about the blue color issue as well, which is seemed to be a reoccurring thing. Whether there's science behind it or not, I'm not sure, but it is another question. But it's weird what materials burn. A lot of cars, they're plastic lenses they're not glass, right? They're usually plastic lenses on all your lights, and those would be generally the stuff that, as radiant heat, if one car's catching the other car on fire, usually that's what the plastics and the rubbers are what are going to catch on first before the metal ever catches on fire. Yeah. And then some metals will actually create their own oxygen and you can't put them out. So magnesium is one of those that's oftenly found in aftermarket products in cars. Also, some of the older cars had aluminum and magnesium components in them, which become extremely hard to put out, basically like phosphorus or something. It is very difficult to put out. You can drown them in water and they don't go out. So you've got a lot of different things going on there. So you've really got to take each car, look at the model, the make, look at what elements are in that car, where the fuel tanks are located. Rubber, we all know when you see a car on fire and you see the big black smoke, that's generally the tires. The tires put off the big, heavy black smoke. And the tires are another thing that like to burn. Once they're ignited, they're hard to put out. And so you'll see a common thread of tires all being missing, and yet you have that car right there where the metal looks quite burned and the tire's not burned. So
Right.
that's kind of weird. That's something that catches my eye. I'm
Let's
not
let's
God.
let's
Yeah,
look at
go ahead.
another one here. Now, this was taken, I took this picture that is right next to where the light brush burnt, but there was no other fuel other than the car just parked in this area. You could see it was on, asphalt. The asphalt here in the back is perfectly fine. It's not burnt around. And what's strange is you can see this Quonset hut here that is a storage area that was untouched. This house, there was a few tiles on the roof that were that needed repair, but other than that,
Yeah.
it was perfectly fine. And even you can see this dead, combustible material here that's still intact. And again, it, it looks like it was just cut in half. And this
Yeah.
whole back part, you can even see the cans here in the storage area that were in perfectly fine shape.
And that's the two things, what you just noticed, the first things that popped in my head was that the three things that you keyed on, and that's the first three things that popped in my head. Here you have basically a white building or a very light colored building that would be very susceptible to smoke damage and charring and stuff. And you can see they've got asphalt shingles right there on that little eyebrow roof that pops out over, looks like maybe a laundry room or whatever that is. And those don't look to be damaged really that bad. And you've got ultra thin, dry, what we would call kindling up on that fence. That's the stuff you would start fires with. And the reason you start fires with that little stuff instead of big logs is because it readily ignites more than a tree. You can't take a 10-inch tree and hit it with a big lighter and catch it on fire. It's pretty hard to do. Try it sometime. And yet that little light stuff is what you put together in a pile, make a kindling, and that starts the fire. Then that gets the bigger woods on fire. And then that's how you create a fire. So it's really strange. And especially if heat rises, that's right in the heat path of that fire. And yet there it is, not burned. And that is extremely, goes against a lot of physics right there. And then in the cabinet, the little cabinet in the side where he's got his, I can't really tell what they are, but if they're aerosol cans, they don't take much to rupture and pop. And they'll usually show signs of weakening and like bulging on them when they get hot. And if, that fire looked like it was a very hot fire in the cab area, in the front area of that car. And yet those cans don't look that compromised. But then there's the tire right next to it that's not burned either. It looks like it was burned enough to make it go flat, but it didn't ignite completely. So there's these really weird lines on where the fire just was completely devastating and where it really was ineffective. And those lines are really kind of a question. They just don't look natural. But that's just me, and I'm not God's gift of firefighting. I've done it for a while, and I pay attention. I've been to a lot of different schools and classes on almost everything in the fire department. I've got a lot of certificates in everything from bomb making or energized materials labs, they call it, nuclear stuff. I've handled VX and different nerve agents, all kinds of crazy stuff. And this just is, these are the questions that you're seeing. These are the questions I'm seeing too. And those are just questions, at this point.
Yeah.
But that's where I really think that you need to focus and look at, because it doesn't add up. It just doesn't look right.
Yeah, Tim, I can understand aluminum melting. It melts at 1200 degrees, which
Yeah,
is within the
1200.
range. But
Yeah.
steel, here we have the steel doors, steel melting off that previous vehicle we've seen.
There's
How would
different
that be? Because steel's 2500 degrees as far as I
right. And then you
understand.
got to look at that's what I'm saying. You got to look at the make of the cars and find out if it's true steel, what type of steel it is. Is it an alloy or what's going on there? Because the different alloys may have components in them that are more readily to burn than hard iron, cold iron. But also a lot of the cars now, they have a boron rod that runs horizontally through the dashboard. And we have these thing called the jaws of life. Everybody's heard about them. And you get into a car accident and you start using this tool and you cut open things. So the nadir pins on the doors are pretty hard steel that locks your door. And those are things that you can actually break your cutters if you don't do it right, or you're using the wrong cutter in the wrong way. And then that boron rod that runs through the dashboard from side to side, it's a very heavy structural component, and it's not readily cut with those tools. We're told to avoid it because we could damage our cutters. And so those are different metals. And so what you really need to do is look at the different metals in each vehicle and then do what you just said. Like we know aluminum burns at 1200 degrees, start finding the degrees that these other fuels or in metals are burned at. Even the glass, which is very suspect to me because glass is pretty high temp and prolonged.
Yep, 2500, and you can see 2500 degrees, and you can see how it's curved and just melted here,
Correct.
along here.
Yeah, so even if you had 2000, 2500 degrees to melt the, start melting the glass for it to get that liquefied and look like grilled cheese sandwich, that's prolonged, right? That's probably not instantaneous. Glass has a long heating and cooling period without it breaking. So when you play with glass, you have to heat it up very slowly and you have to cool it very slowly or it'll break on its own accord, right? So to see it that intact and smooth like that without being all fractured, just from the picture, I'm not there really looking at it up close, but that's another thing that looks very strange to me. So these are all things that looking at the individual components in the car and finding out what temperatures they burn. Then also, if the car was that hot, then how did that little grass on the fence not get scorched at all?
Not only that, but look at this photograph. Look at how these shrubs here all have their leaves on them.
Yeah.
In this house is totally fine and intact. It was this is a picture I took, and it was right in the middle of a driveway, and the driveway was perfectly fine. The asphalt wasn't burnt or anything like that. So again, it just leaves some very strange questions in terms of what you've seen before. Have you ever seen a car torched like this in a large fire, and then have the building right next to it be perfectly fine?
So once again, here's where the wind direction comes into play. If the wind was coming from the angle of the camera taking the picture, that house should have damage or at least char marks on it. That wall should be black. Those bushes should be pretty crispy and burnt, if not ignited. If the fire was coming from the house and rolling back this way, it might create a katabatic lift with a little bit of air roll coming over that roof and suck some heat back that way. But even with a temperature that's hot enough to melt glass and steel in that car, to not have enough radiant heat to do any damage to that house, that's really peculiar.
Okay, good. So let's continue on here. Now, certainly there was such an incredible amount of destruction, and you can see just the before and after photograph on how everything is really reduced to a white ash. There's, except for the trees, and again, as you look at the amount of destruction and how everything is just totally leveled, there's no real timbers left or anything along that line. Have you seen this type of white ash destruction? And again, with all these different trees and things remaining, again, the wind was blowing this way. So these palm trees, you'd think they'd be able to ignite also with this intensity of heat. But again, we're not the fire experts. So
yeah, and I'm not going to tell you I'm an expert. I don't know what an expert is, what that qualification is, to be in a court of law and all that stuff. But we all go to our training. We're all certified in all these different things. We've been to many fires in our careers. And the things that I look at in this that's kind of interesting. So white ash. So okay, so when something burns, it's just not just like it caught on fire and it burned, right? So just for an example that you would understand, you go to the grocery store and you buy lump charcoal, right? So it's been burned, it burned, right? But it's still it hasn't completely been changed chemically, right? It didn't go through complete combustion. It's incomplete combustion. So it burned to a point, but there's still a lot of fuel in that fuel source, right? So you buy it, you put it in your barbecue and you cook your steak. Well, white ash is complete combustion. So that means you can't go back and grab white ash and relight it on fire like you can charcoal. You're not going to cook your steak on white ash. There's nothing left to burn to give off any kind of heat, BTUs. So when you see white ash, you're looking at complete combustion. So those are very extremely high temperatures to completely, use up all the fuel in a fuel source. And yet, like you can see off to the middle of your screen where that green belt along the ocean kind of runs right by those houses. I mean, that doesn't look more than a few feet away. And that house presumably had to be at least 15 to 20 feet tall if it's single story. I didn't see the before picture to remember which one's which. But So if you have a 2-story house there and it's in complete combustion mode where it's free burning and you're getting off that kind of heat and you have a palm tree right there at the same height of that structure, look at the trees, how they're just almost overhanging the houses. And for them not to burn, it just doesn't, that's completely crazy. I mean, that's not something I've ever seen, if that's what you're asking. I don't know the science behind it, but that is highly irregular. A lot of those, if you look at that before and after picture, it tells you a lot. There's palm trees right there that are actually overhanging the roof of the structure. Now you got to go back and see if that palm tree is still standing on your after picture, if that thing's still there, if it's gone. I'm sure a lot of those burned up palm trees are those ones that were hanging over the roof. But there are some that are still standing, and those are the ones you want to try to match the pictures from where you get the still standing ones that are unaffected and the before picture to see where they were in relation to that fuel load, because that's highly irregular,
Yep. So as we continue on with these anomalies, another one was that there was plastic that survived. We have reports of people who went back to their property and they actually had plastic pots around their property. Everything else was destroyed to white ash, and yet those plastic pots have remained. Here's a plastic piggy bank taken from the ash.
And that's really, really, really crazily irregular. So here's the thing, and I'm not going to try to be a conspiracy theorist, but I got to say it because it's what's in my head and that's how I roll. But you put a piece of plastic in the microwave, what happens? You put a piece of metal in the microwave, what happens? I don't know, but that piece of plastic, if it was anywhere in that area that steel burned and everything else burned and it's completely intact and it's just, it really is plastic, it's not ceramic, that's crazy. And there's no way that should ever happen, because the plastic should be the first thing to melt. Even if it didn't burn, it should have melted into a puddle. And so that's another thing that's just beyond explanation. And I'd like to see him try to, or whoever they are, but I'd like to see the experts or the scientists try to tell you how that happened. Unless that thing was at the bottom of a swimming pool, there's no way that thing should have survived intact without being warped or blackened or melted. And I can't tell that it really is plastic. I'm taking your word for it. But
another thing is that certainly there were a lot of blue objects, also blue car, blue shirts, blue umbrellas that survived. And have you ever seen anything where you had anomalies of objects of certain color spectrum surviving?
Not color spectrum, and at least not if I did, I never noticed it because it wasn't something that was so reoccurring that it popped into my mind as something that was happening. But I can tell you what's interesting, and I've been to plenty of house fires, and you know, a lot of times after the fire's been extinguished, you know, the people want to get back in there and see if their money's there, or their cell phone or whatever, you know, their belongings. And so a lot of times the guys will say, hey, you know, take them in, make sure they'll take a firefighter with each person to make sure they're safe. And we'll walk them in where it's safe, and we'll stand right with them and let them kind of dig around some of the ashes to see what they can recover, you know, family photos, some of those things that are irreplaceable. And interestingly enough, oxygen plays such a huge key in fires because you need the oxygen. Without the oxygen, you have no fire. And you'll find books that are burned on the outside completely, but then you open the pages, and because the oxygen wasn't allowed to get inside the pages, they actually were pretty intact. You could open up and read them. They're brittle, they break real easy because all the moisture has been pulled out of them. But a lot of times books, it's very common to find books surviving in a fire. So if you go to these houses and there's not any books that aren't completely incinerated, if they're all completely incinerated, you know, that's telling you that the temperatures were way above what a normal house fire is, because many house fires, I go back and you'll find books that are still readable, you know. So that's another thing that will give you an indication on how hot it actually was.
Great, good information. And I guess this raises a question that in terms of what we're concerned about, does what you've just seen here, Tim, from your perspective, justify having an independent investigation? And again, I think there's a lot of mistrust happening with our federal government and our state government at this point in time. And do you feel that what we're doing here as a citizens investigation, where local residents are gathering data, we're getting a lot of interviews, we're getting photographs from and videos from people who were actually in the fire, do you feel that we're justified in doing this when we start to look at all these strange things that have occurred?
I believe you're beyond justified. I mean, I'm so happy that you're actually doing this, and you guys seem to be doing it the right way and with the right intent. And like I say, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist and all that stuff, but I gotta say, there's so many questionable irregularities at this incident, everything about it. And unless they destroy those audio logs, which would be criminal, and that would basically just show that it is a criminal act if they did something where you didn't get those audio logs. Those audio logs, I believe, are going to really shine a lot of light on a lot of your questions about what was going on, where the information was coming from, who was given it, why resources were allocated the way they were. There's got to be at least 20 bullet points that I look up that are just questionable, if nothing else, questionable. And some of them are downright, like, I'd look at it like, man, that's libel. You know, it doesn't look, I would never go and stand in front of a judge in a court and say, yeah, I used all my firefighters to go block traffic, and, you know, none of them went down and saved any lives or whatever. You know, I look at things like that, just the hierarchy of our responsibility as far as, you know, what we're doing, and everybody's got their spin on it, I guess, so to speak. And when I look at them, you know, meaning Josh Green and the police chief and all these guys up there saying what they're saying, it just looks like they're trying to cover their ass the best way possible and spin it the best way they can. And they're just, that's it. That's our statement. And you guys just take it and accept it. And I don't find it acceptable. You know, and it's like I said, it's easy to armchair quarterback something. I wasn't there, and being there is a whole different thing. But I can offer my 2 cents and maybe my 1.5 cents, whatever it adds up to. But I do see a lot of irregularities. And I have a very strong connection with Lahaina itself, because I did a lot of work in that town before I was a firefighter. And I thought I was going to move to Lahaina, and that's where I was going to live my life. But I ended up on Kauai, and it worked out well. But I have a lot of love for all the people of Lahaina, and I feel in many ways things were done by the government or the people in control that causing their impact to be greatened instead of lessened. And we're supposed to lessen the impact of these things, not make it worse. And I feel that the impact was made worse by a lot of the stuff during and after the incident, instead of making it better, which is what we're all trying to do, is make it better, right?
And again, the strangeness of all of this, one of the big things that really drove the fire, obviously, was the wind. And there's a lot of strangeness associated with that also. And Bruce, you want to just ask us questions also about the changing winds that were experienced during the fire and the intensity of it. So Bruce, if you want to take over and just show Tim some of the strange things that you've captured. So good. So there's your log that Bruce said he would send some more pictures of.
Yeah, so it looks like the very outside of that's hardly even affected at all. The skin of the log looks like it hasn't even been touched by flame, yet the inside is charcoal. That's just not how it usually works. Hey, Bruce, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Did you see the video that some guy put out? I have possession of it. I could probably email it to you. A guy put out a comparison of the video of the hurricane that was off Cabo just recently, the one that went up and wiped out and made it to Nevada. And did you see showed the tracking of that hurricane, and he did a whole little weather thing on it? Did you see that one?
I didn't see that one, but I've got this hurricane to track, and I'm going to show that in just a second.
You might want to look at this one, because what he did is he took that hurricane and he took the strength and size of the hurricane and how far it was from Cabo San Lucas shore. And he showed actual footages of the winds that day. And they were up to like 60 miles an hour, maybe not even, I don't think they ever hit 80. I think we're up to like 60, 65 from my memory. And when you look at the pictures, you know it's blowing 65 miles an hour wind. They look completely different than the wind pictures of what the wind's doing to the trees in Maui. Like, it looks like Maui had half the wind speed that these guys had, and they only got up to 60 on their reports. And when you look at the difference, immediately you go, wow, there's not even a comparison. So yeah. I could send you that video if you want, or I could send it to Paul, and you could send it, get it to you, but it's pretty interesting just for knowledge to look, because it shows you like, well, here's what they were saying the wind was, and then they show the pictures of 60-mile-an-hour winds and crazy compared to what they're claiming on Maui, and the pictures are night and day. So
Yeah, I'd love to see that. I'd love to see that. And so I'm going to go back to a photo here, and you take a look at it and you can see the big trunk here is burned on the inside, but not the outside. But what really gets telling is here's a small piece right here.
that's the one I looked at.
And that one, you can see it's charred on the inside, but the outside of the bark is still totally intact.
Not even burnt, not even burnt, not even
Not
dark.
even burned.
Yeah,
But
and
you see the inside.
and that's what I was talking about. That was exact. That's a great photo for that, proving that point. Because, and the other thing you want to do when you take these photos is try to get the photo all the way around that object, like the back side of it or whatever. So you can't see if it was that way all the way around the piece of wood, or one side might have been the fuse side where the fire impacted.
Well, unfortunately, at this point, the National Guard were chasing us away. So.
Yeah, no. I'm just saying, to be 100% like, but yeah, when you look at that photo, I look at it, I go, that is so, it's like someone barbecued it from the inside out.
Yeah.
And that's not, I've never seen that ever naturally occurring.
So I'm going to show you the wind anomalies here. I'll
Okay.
start by showing what the wind pattern looked like. Each day, there's a high resolution shot that happens twice a day all across the entire world. And so twice a day it comes over Hawaii, and we get these high resolution shots. This is August 5th. You see normal weather patterns coming at us, AM and PM. And on the 6th, you see normal weather patterns, AM, 6 PM. But on the 7th, you start seeing the lines, the clouds lining up in lines. And by the afternoon of the 7th, the day before the fire, you see it in pronounced cloud lines coming at me. And I live on the North Shore. I was watching these strange straight line clouds going across the sky one after another, and kind of made a mental note like, well, I haven't seen that before. It was coming on the North Shore of Maui, where I live. And what's also strange is you see it gets to Hawaii, the Hawaiian island chains, and it stops. It doesn't go past us.
Right.
These winds are coming from this direction here in a straight line. And all these pictures, you don't see that pattern. I'm going to back up one day. You'll see the same thing. In the morning, the pattern was not coming at us on the other thing.
Right. I see that.
Okay.
I see the line. It runs right through the whole chain.
And here's the morning of the 8th. And again, there's different daylight and evening time pictures. But you still see the lines coming at us in the morning of the 8th. And this is when the actual fire was happening.
Go back one. So these foggy patterns that are behind it, is that the lee? Is that the
That's
mountain?
the leeward side. So that often happens where clouds will billow around, but you don't see these clouds didn't continue beyond the Hawaiian Islands. They stopped right there.
Right. But my thing is that it's kind of interesting to me. You can see where it goes through the isthmus from Kahului to Kihei, and you got that little clear zone, but then it connects right between Lanai and Lahaina.
Mhm.
And so that's indicating that that's a lee zone. So if that's a lee, that means it's being blocked by the mountain that's in front of it, and it's blocked. They call it katabatic and adiabatic winds. They roll around like a rock in the middle of a river, right, so to speak.
Mhm.
If the winds are claiming the winds were so strong and everything, but look, Lahaina is in the lee. It's actually got a little break right there where it's not being blown out. You can see where it's blown out in the isthmus between Kahului and Kihei, where the winds funnel through there always.
Correct.
And then
Right
it
in here.
blew that out. There's no clouds right there. But if this was so impacted by the wind, then how come those clouds are still there? They're not blown out.
Right.
in Lahaina.
Very curious. But
See what I
that's the morning of the 8th. Here's the afternoon of the 8th. And curiously enough, Maui got blocked out.
Oh, yeah. Another coincidence.
Another coincidence.
Yeah, just add that to the list.
Now, these black lines do occasionally happen across the screens,
Exactly.
taking out a part of the screen, but it's just a coincidence that this perfectly hit the fire hit. There's also other records where during the time of the fire, the records were removed. People have shown where they were removed from the satellite records. But here again, you see during the clouds in a perfect straight line coming at us.
I have a
Here's
video.
the followers day on the 9th, and you see that we're back to normal cloud patterns on the 9th.
Of course. But once again, Lahaina is in the lee of that last shot again. It's got a heavier cloud buildup there. So that's a natural occurring lee spot for that island with that wind direction, it looks like. And so it's kind of funny that they're claiming so much wind push there.
So now this is where I save these video loops. They're like, 8 to 10 hours each. I have to save them in real time because they don't last. And then I string them together into one long string to try to get a picture of these weather patterns to see what happens. So this is Hurricane Dora forming off the coast of Mexico, a place where they normally, at 10 degrees latitude, they normally form.
Yep.
You see it picking up wind. And then as it forms a hurricane, it gets really tight. It does a proper funnel. And, I don't see any aerosol anomalies or anything with this. So it looks like a normal hurricane, natural hurricane to me. And you see it coming across the Hawaiian Islands. It stays at 10 degrees latitude, which is what normal hurricanes are supposed to do, because that's where they can sustain their forces. They don't hit cooler waters to the north. But then you see anomalies start happening to the north. As the hurricane's passing like 500 degrees to the south, you see in this area right up in here where the clouds are broken up, and you see the strange anomaly of these, in this area here, you can start even seeing frequencies kind of like being formed and creating these wave after wave of clouds. And that right there is when the hurricane hits us. When the storm hits us, the hurricane's actually already passed.
Right.
At the moment it happens, and then it goes on its merry way, and then we're suddenly back to normal clouds again.
Yeah.
So repeating this pattern here, this is the area here where I'm seeing, if you look at it, and I'm going to do a little CGI on it to make that stand out even more, but you can see, an anomaly of, I'm going to keep repeating it here. You can see where the frequencies start generating in this area up there. And almost like a cymatics pattern, where you're putting frequencies on sand and seeing all these patterns happen. And then you see the wave after wave coming up.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I'm not a weather expert, but I do see what you're recognizing, and I can see it with my own eyes on this thing. And it's definitely, I would like to see another couple hurricanes besides this one with that same imagery, and then see if those type of clouds were common in that or in other hurricanes, or if that's just something that was only with this hurricane. Because I don't know what is normal, a baseline. Is that a normal weather pattern to travel along topside of hurricane? I'm not sure.
I've been watching for 15 years and saving all the hurricanes, and I've never seen anything like that before, especially that obvious pattern peeling. I mean, everyone wonders, where did this wind come from? And you can see there's normal clouds north of the hurricane that aren't doing anything weird, but it's, way further to the north.
Yeah, no, I get it. And like I say, you're the weather expert, so I should be asking you the questions on how this works. I know a couple of weather gurus over here that I, used to hang out with quite a bit, and they're all into it like you are. It's not really, I just want to know if it's going to be good to go fishing or not. It's definitely questionable, and there is definitely a line there where you see that happening, where it's just only isolated to that zone right there, which is definitely questionable and something you'd want to look into. But I know what you're talking about the frequencies of sand and water when they're introduced to different frequencies, that they come up with patterns. And it does look like some sort of a print or pattern. It doesn't look completely organic.
And I think that also, in terms of the weather report, the reports that initially came out, they were saying it was Hurricane Dora that was creating those winds. This hurricane, a small hurricane actually, was actually 500 miles away. And normally winds patterns of a hurricane go about 50 miles from the epicenter of the hurricane itself. And you can see the winds spiraling out, but it really does not reach that 500-mile mark in terms of where the actual fire is.
No, and that's why that video that I have of that one, it shows the wind and the weather pattern of the hurricane that just went up, or Hillary or whatever, that just went up the coast, turned up at Baja instead of coming across Bez. And when you look at those pictures and see their wind speeds, which are much lower than what they're claiming these wind speeds were, but when you see the photos, it's night and day. It's dramatic. like you're showing me a picture and you go, oh, that's supposed to be 80-mile-an-hour winds. That don't even look like 30-mile-an-hour winds to me, looking at the picture. When you look at these other pictures, it's like 35, 40 miles an hour, and man, it looks like 34 miles an hour. It's you could see it. And I think that they're giving numbers out that don't correlate with the reality of what was really going on.
Well, that's just it. I think that we're giving a lot of stuff that doesn't correlate with reality and saying that this is the cause. One other thing is the temperatures. Certainly there's a mantra going on, especially by our Governor Green, that it's global warming. And when we look at the temperatures since 1936, we see that there's just normal fluctuations. And there are many years that were much warmer than than these years. So again, this mantra of global warming, again, when you look at the facts and data, it doesn't add up.
Yeah, the tail's wagging the dog on this whole global warming thing, and everybody with a brain and critical thinking skills knows that. Also, you're talking about the white powder. It's been pretty established now that they have been doing geoengineering globally and spraying strontium, barium, and aluminum, and a whole bunch of other stuff in that cocktail too. And I'm sure that's not good for us as humans, or good for our trees and plants and fish and all that other stuff. And we all know that aluminum, well, put it this way, you can take non-flammable substances sometimes, depending on what they are, and grind them up into a fine enough powder and sprinkle them over a campfire, and they will flare that campfire up. So it just the surface area of very fine dust. When a fire is attacking a fuel or trying to convert a fuel, it's all about surface area. And the more surface area you have, the more it's going to readily ignite. So if you take a piece of paper and try to catch it on fire, it's going to catch on fire and burn up at a certain time. If you take that paper and you fold it a couple times and you rip it into shreds, and it's still intact as one piece of paper, but it's got rips all in it, it's going to burn way faster because you've increased the surface area of that paper. So with that theory, fine dust of most any kind promotes an ignition. So flour, just cooking flour, take a handful of cooking flour and throw it over a campfire, and you're going to see it's going to flare up because of the surface area, and flour, it may burn, but it's not something we consider flammable. I mean, it'll catch on fire if you let it, but it's not like, these other things. So you take aluminum and strontium and barium, and I'm not as familiar with the strontium and barium. All I know, anything with an in it is not really good for us. And you sprinkle that on the fire, and you're going to see probably increased temperatures, and ignition is going to, easeability is going to go way up.
Well, we did notice that white haze before the thing, and I've seen hazes before. I've never seen that white type of haze. And I can imagine that if, how do you create steam, or for a concert or something, use ultrasound on water and it creates a vapor and stuff. So I can imagine if some sort of frequency is being played out there, then you can create that funny white haze that looked like, something at a concert,
Yeah, it could have been that, like a fog machine type thing, where it's creating that, pulling the moisture out of things. And maybe they did that prior to the fire so that the humidity, the moisture content of the materials ignited more readily. I mean, that would be an angle to check into, because it's all about moisture, right? You put water on a fire, that's how you put it out. Water is 100% moisture, right? It's just moisture. It's got oxygen in it, which is basically an oxidizer, but it doesn't get used because of its state, right? But when you turn it into steam, it expands 2,100 times. I think it's 2,100 times its size. So a molecule of water expands when it turns into steam readily. And we actually have a lot of trees in the islands that hold a lot of water. And when they're subjected to massive heat, they literally explode. And it's not because they're on fire. It's because the water is vaporizing and fast inside them so fast, it expands and blows it up.
So here's a plausible, reason. Obviously, I can't prove anything, but do we have the technology to create frequencies, in the cloud layers? Yes, we do. Here's one of those technologies.
Yep.
This sometimes sits in the Honolulu Harbor at Pearl Harbor. It's a HARP installation.
Yeah.
They call it the HARP Dome. Used to be a big HARP installation up in Alaska, a
Yep.
big array, but that became obsolete. And what is HARP? It's an ionospheric heater. It shoots radio waves, high power radio waves. And you can see there's a lot of high power capacitor chambers and stuff on this boat. There's a high power, capability to generate energy on this boat.
Right.
You heat up the ionosphere, which is highest part in the stratosphere. That's where the ozone layer is. And it heats it up and makes it actually raise up higher. So it's an ionospheric heater. It's Tesla technology. Tesla did that back in the early part of the century. And then you suddenly turn it off and you create a frequency down below. You can actually create a vibration. Well, Tesla knew that 5 hertz is the frequency of an earthquake. He actually made an earthquake happen in upstate New York with its ionospheric heater that's been well documented, where normally earthquakes don't happen, by heating it up and then dropping it and creating a vibration. So do we have the technology to create frequencies, to create wave after wave of wind pattern? Yes, we do. We do have the technology. Was it used in this case? I don't know. But here it is coming in. You can see it in Seattle right there, where it's coming into port, Seattle,
Right.
with the dome. So it stays out in the Pacific. They call it Pacific Theater. And it is quite capable of doing weather manipulation.
Yeah, as far as all those technologies goes, I read up on them. I'm probably not as scientifically read up on them as you are, but I'm familiar with this thing, and they've got many others that do. They've got stationary arrays. I believe there's one in Oroville, California. Once again, you're going to get another guy that's very similar to you that broadcast stuff. Is called One Pacific Redwood. Check out his site, and he'll show you when there's a hurricane developing or a rainstorm developing. It develops in a circular pattern, and as it gets more organized, it spins tighter and tighter, and that's how it builds its strength. And they can shoot these microwave beams or whatever they are, radio waves, into these things and create a right angle in that storm, and it breaks up the storm. And he shows it literally, like you're showing me those pictures with the wind and all the stuff. He's got those pictures. He shows. He goes, "Oh, here was California has all those fires. They were going to get a bunch of rain because fires create rain too. They put particulate in the sky, right? And they heat up everything. And so they suck up more moisture, and then that moisture wants to come back down. So fires actually create weather." And this guy shows you, oh, here was some weather, coming in to help with the fires in California. And they shot it with this, whatever beam you're calling it, microwave thing. And then it breaks up the thing and they get no water. So they could break up the storms. And he guy shows it like, oh, here it's happening, just like you are. And it's pretty cool to watch. And as far as them having the technology, I have no doubt that they have it. So I think you're right on track with all that stuff. That's what it looks like right there. And Oroville has one of these.
Yeah. This is the array in Alaska. And it's called HARP, High Energy Active Oral Research Program. And it is an ionospheric heater. And it is capable of heating up the ionosphere and creating a low pressure cell underneath it. And through that, you can guide storms and things by creating low pressure cells and deciding if you have multiple of these arrays around the world, which we do, then you can have multiple arrays pointing to the same spot and have even more effect. So was this being used? Was this an engineered windstorm, or was this a natural windstorm? And this is something that, was quintessential to the whole thing, was the wind. I mean, you can have a wind and some arsonists going around starting fires and burn down a town.
Yep.
You don't have to have directed energy weapons or other things. You can just have arson.
Yeah, you're right.
And I did find some arson points for the fires just outside of Laniapoko. There's on the Lahaina side, there's 2 different places on either side of the road where you can see where the fire started and made its pathway down toward Lahaina, about 30 feet off the road, further than you can flick a cigarette. You have to get out of your car, go. You can see where the weeds were lit right alongside the road. You see a long tail going for a long period of time, then it expands, gets bigger and bigger. That's on the side of the highway. So that shows me that those brush fires were not started, by lightning or a telephone pole. There's nothing around it. They were arson points.
Yeah, and lightning's I have been to a lightning strike fire in Hawaii once in my career, that I know of. It was confirmed. Other than that, lightning strikes in Hawaii are generally pretty rare. That's not something that happens to us in Hawaii as much as other places in the world because of our humidity. But not saying it couldn't happen, but it is a more irregular occurrence.
Well, I grew up in Missouri and I did see trees that were hit by lightning. And it's interesting because lightning is plasma energy,
Yep.
the
Plasma.
fourth state of energy. So plasma is created within lightning. And the trees burnt from the inside out with lightning striking, particularly at the base of the tree. When the lightning hits it, when it hits the ground, then that's where it disperses in the most heat comes. So the root of the tree is actually starting to burn, when lightning hits, and you get an internal thing.
Correct.
And with these points, we're seeing not only here, but other fires around the world. I mean, we're not the only one. The big people know about is Paradise, California.
Ilona, Paradise, all those.
And you see all these pictures of trees burnt from the inside out. We're seeing the same thing here. Then we can't rule anything out. I mean, was it a combination of natural or engineered wind, arson points for sure? Were there other sorts of things involved? I don't know.
And that plasma, the lightning, when it hits the tree, it's using the moisture in the tree as its conductivity to reach ground, right? It's trying to ground out, right? So it's the moisture into that tree. So the more moisture in the tree, the more of a lightning rod it is, so to speak. And the more, like I said, when that lightning hits the tree, it also turns that water into steam instantaneously. It expands 2,100 times its size molecularly, and a lot of times it'll blow the trees. Will actually blow up, kind of. That's why you'll see a big, huge tree and it got hit by lightning, and like maybe halfway down the tree is gone. It's just blown up and gone, right? And then it finally reaches the ground, and then it does what you say. As it hits the ground, there's that kind of release of energy at that point too. And we see that every once in a while, but it's a lot more rare in Hawaii. The fact that one tree picture you have where that limb is sawed off, and you can see the bark is completely unscathed, and then the inside's charred, not just burnt. That's real good to me. I'm not a scientist, but that's crazy. I mean, that's not normal physics, right? Here's
another one. Everyone knows this famous building on, Front Street,
Yep.
Lahaina. But someone took a reel of driving by as the fire was burning, and you see the base of the tree right here. Got green grass all the way around it. It's got sidewalk in front of it. And you see the base of the tree right here is on fire. Is that something normal that you've ever seen before?
The only way that I would see that would happen is if there was some collected ironwood needles in a little crack there and around all that burl, and a cinder just happened to hit that exact spot and caught those little pine needles, dried pine needles, and that all the pine needles on that tree look to be very green. But a lot of time, that's the only way I could see that just on the bark of that tree that a cinder is going to just catch it on fire like that. That's kind of weird,
Yeah.
But like I say, I'm looking at a picture from far away, and I'm not right there, but it is kind of irregular that it didn't fuse over from the fire on the house or anywhere else. That was the origin of that fire of the tree, is at that point right there. So how did that get ignited? Very interesting, And an ironwood tree is not something that you just go walk up with a lighter and you catch it on fire. They're kind of, it's a pretty dense wood. It's not what you would use for kindling. It's what you would use to sustain long-term burning.
Yeah. Well, that tree did, burn all the way down, and the tree to the right, which was unaffected, was still pretty much intact after the burn.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. Like I say, there's a lot of anomalies, those little case by case things. You have to sit there and say, how could this happen? And then reason out probability, go through the thing, say, wow, it's like a 90% probability that this didn't happen naturally, whatever, and you're going to have to just take case by case on that, because nothing can be lumped together. Each little thing is its own incident. Every tree that burned, every car that burned, every house that didn't burn, those are all things that you're collectively taking in. And then, but like you said earlier, there's an extreme amount of anomalies that demand real answers, not just. And I do believe that the wind speeds that they're posting for that fire, you know more about the weather than I do, but I don't think the wind speeds were nearly what they were saying they were. I think they were much more reduced than what they're claiming. And if you look at the pictures, I mean, and they said there was no helicopters flying in, and I've seen pictures from people's phones of helicopters, big birds, big Ericssons or big, Sikorskis, like big sky crane type birds, flying around there. And I've seen the pictures. Now I can't vet that well from where I am because, I have no way of doing that. But there are pictures out there that there were large aircraft flying around during the fire, and whether we can validate those or not, I don't know. But if there was aircraft flying, my question is, so there's a MASS unit on Oahu, right? It's a military support helicopter, and I used to work on that crew. On my days off from the fire department, I'd fly to Oahu and Big Island, and I'd work at the PTA and over there. And it's a portion of the military that interfaces with the public when the public resources aren't available or overrun. And so some of the smaller little birds, like the Hughes 500s, that these guys fly around, and they call them Bambi buckets full of water, and they use helicopters to put out fires a lot. I'm sure you're familiar with that. You see them flying around with the big thing underneath, and they drop water. Well, they have a much lower wind threshold for those helicopters. The VNE that those helicopters can perform, especially exterior loads like that, heavy exterior loads, are quite limited. But these big military birds are quite capable of much more extreme conditions and being able to operate in. And that was one of my other questions is, why didn't ask for military support with the larger aircraft to come in and do water drops of some sort? Because they were obviously flying in those conditions, because I've seen pictures of them. So why weren't these more capable, larger resources? Usually they have them pre-set up, with memorandums, MOAs, in case this happens, we can call you for additional support. There you go. There's a big bird. That's actually a Chinook. So that can do quite a bit. The ones that I saw pictures of were more like sky cranes, where they're not so much for people and stuff inside of them. They're more like a skeleton, but they can pick up containers and whatnot, and pick them up and move them into different areas. But that would be a good example of what I'm talking about. And that's a large water drop. That's a much bigger bucket, Bambi bucket, than you'd be able to use on like the fire department helicopters, right? They could probably use 250 gallons. And in those wind speeds, maybe only 100 gallons. I don't even know if they were operable in those wind speeds, but I still question the wind speeds, that they weren't valid. I think the wind speeds were much less than they're claiming. So
this picture was taken 2 weeks after the fire, and they were still putting out hotspots using this technology.
Yeah, and that's our, okay, this is too big for us, and we use this on a daily basis in brush fires. Even on Kauai, we just don't have that asset as far as that heavy lift bird to be able to haul around that big of a Bambi bucket. That's quite a large, that's huge. That's like dropping a swimming pool on somebody. That bucket is a lot of water, not quite a swimming pool, more like a jacuzzi, but it's a lot of water. And when the impact hits the ground, it hits the ground and it blows out laterally, and it's like a water bomb. It puts out quite a bit of fire. It's amazing what it can do. It can also do some damage too, because it's water, 8 pounds a gallon. But I was very surprised they weren't using these larger assets that could handle those weather conditions and try to use those to help mitigate the situation. That was one of my questions as well. It was like, why was there not these assets deployed? I don't know. There's just too many things. There's at least 20 points that you could go down, bullet points with questions that just seem to need to be answered.
Well, actually, Tim, we actually have about over 50 right now that we're looking at, and you just added a few more actually. So thank you in terms of the investigation.
Yeah. So I mean, this thing, it's, when we look, it's so multifaceted, right? There's before, during, and after. So you got different time frames as this thing developed. I find it very strange that a little brush fire on the side of the road with high enough winds, they jump the road. I've seen it happen a lot of times. So that, that is plausible. But that a fire that, originally where that fire was supposedly started looked like it was up away from that bypass road quite a ways, like up more Mauka. And then all of a sudden the fire's down on the side of the road. And I'm like, well, how did it get from there to there without nobody noticing it? That's a kind of a long distance, right? For no one to go, hey, fire department, the fire's back, and it's coming towards the road. I mean, it seemed like quite a geographical distance between where they're saying it started, the incipient point, and where it finally hit the town. And I know fire can burn fast, and especially if it's wind driven, but that seemed like, weird that it got from up there to down there, and it doesn't seem like there was a fuse or a connecting point. And, you know, it just, there's a lot of, another bullet point, you know, so.
Sure. Bruce, do you have any more questions of Tim at this time?
Well, I do have this video that I took here of what I'm calling a probable ignition point alongside the highway, and then I found one opposite side of the street later. This is just on the Laniapoko side. And you can see right up here in this tall brush, about 30, 40 feet off the highway, further than you can flick a cigarette.
Right.
You can see that point right there. And the winds normally blow this way, like 99% of the time, winds blow toward Lahaina from Laniapoko, you see up above. And you see that point there going along this ridge line and expanding, and I have a little 30-second video.
That's your coning we were talking about. So it starts at a narrow point and then it cones outwardly looking for fuel. And that one showing very slow wind driven, like that's very wide. It's getting wide quickly. So that would be something that didn't have a lot of wind pushing it at that point.
It burns up the hill and then continues down and goes toward Lahaina.
Got it.
Now that's where people think it jumped the highway, but I actually have a separate video where I later discovered the ignition point on the other side of the highway too.
Okay, so if that fire you were just showing, and then you're going down you're sitting with the road, you got the picture of the road, and it looks like it goes under a culvert or a bridge, and it crosses on like a gully or like a little arroyo. And then, so how you would tell is if that fire crossed the road right where they're saying there, and then you took an aerial footage and put a pinpoint on that spot, if there was fire upwind from that spot, that would be irregular. See what I mean? So the fire would be blown downwind, and all that massive heating and stuff would be blown from that point downwind. And that cone, when it jumped across the road, should go through that neighborhood like a cone. And it should be from that point getting wider and wider away from you. But it shouldn't really, I mean, I shouldn't say it shouldn't. If it's really super wind driven, it's hard for that heat, excuse me, to go against the 80-mile-an-hour supposedly winds and burn back up against the wind, and especially if the slope, well, it's a very gradual slope. It's pretty flat right there. But it's just kind of weird that the fire from that point looks like there was burned to the left up further wind upstream, so to speak, from that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's like the fire's burning against the wind, which it can do, but it's not the way it wants to go. So if there's, I don't know in relationship where that point is in town, if that's the middle of town or the—
No, that's Laniapoko. It's just outside of Laniapoko. So it's still quite a ways away from town, but you can see where the fire went toward town and started taking out the south side of the town from that fire. While the other one from Lahaina Luna came down the mountain that way into town. So what I see is a 2-point, burn going on.
Correct. Yeah. So you got two different spots. They're claiming that fire, that it hit the town from two different spots. And it looks like there's quite a distance between those spots. And it looked like there was quite a distance between the original point where the pump shed or whatever that was, that supposedly the power line fell down and caught the grass on fire, where the whole thing started earlier in the day. Those points seem to be like you're looking at a big time difference and a big geographic difference in those areas. And I mean, you're talking about daylight hours, people driving down the street like normal. On Kauai, I can tell you from my experience, we get fires in a place called Anahola, plenty, like all the time. And you're driving down the road, you look over, you see smoke, and you call 911. You say, hey, just reporting smoke at this point on right outside of Anahola, mile marker 13 or whatever it is. And you go, there's a brush fire, and they go, oh, we have that reported already, or oh, thank you, we don't have reports of that. And then they'll send someone out to see if it's a controlled burn or what. And that's the fire department goes out and checks to see what's going on, right? There's a fire. So for that to burn that distance and that long, and no one reporting it, like it almost like they didn't, like it just happened, like it snuck up on them, and it just doesn't make sense. I mean, I can travel quickly and all that, but how many people don't have a cell phone now? right? You're driving along in your car and you see it, they just grab their phone and they go, hey, there's a fire, right? And then you get 50 of those calls. When you get one, you get 50, and that's another thing. It would be good to see those audio logs to see if the calls were coming in and if they were being if they were responded upon, right? You're going to see when the initial, hey, this guy called in, Steve Smith was driving down the road and they saw the fire and they reported it. Well, did anything happen? Did they send the units out? Those are another question you're going to get with those audio logs if you can get a hold of those.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, I don't really have much else. I hope I helped you out in some way. And you can call me at any time. I'll try to send you that video of that one that's really interesting. I think, Bruce, you're going to like it. I don't think it exceeds anything you're doing. It just gives you a really good visual comparison of what you're talking about and what they're saying. And I think it'll be good for you just to look at it. If nothing else, I don't, know if you'll include it in anything, but at least you'll look at it and go, wow, you'll see what I'm talking about with the wind, the pictures of the wind. It's not even, it's crazy. It's night and day.
Good.
And,
well, Tim, this has been extremely valuable for us. Certainly, I think to all the people also looking at our videos and the information that we're collecting, you certainly put things in perspective for us in a way that we can really start to further our investigation even more, and even more questions now also that were raised from your discussion. So greatly appreciative of your expertise that you're sharing with us all here. And we're going to keep on digging. And yes, we'll keep on asking questions, Tim, as we move forward, because I think as we dig more and more, and especially as we do the interviews of people who were in the fire itself, more strange things are starting to surface. So again, we'll be in touch with you as we move forward with all of this.
okay. I think Bruce is real key, valuable asset in what he's doing with the weather, because from an outside perspective, it seems like everything they're saying is based on the weather, right? That was how this happened because of this crazy weather. And we live in Hawaii and hurricanes are normal. And that one wasn't even that close of a hit. And it wasn't even that big. And, I almost feel like it was pre-planned, like, here it comes, here's our chance. And then whatever they did, or I hate to use the word they, because, they is somebody, they have a face and a name, but those weather patterns and that weather showing that's their beginning and end of everything that happened in Lahaina was based on this weather phenomenon. And I think as you dive into the weather and try to explain what could have or couldn't have happened using the weather as the basis, because that's what they're using as their basis for how it was allowed to happen. So I think if that's debunked as a primary target, that's going to really make it easier to debunk some of the other stuff. That's just my opinion. I think the weather is a key component in this whole thing as far as their reasoning of their response and how it happened. And I argue the point that more could have been done. The weather wasn't as bad as they said. And it doesn't explain all these little questions. So
great. Thank you. Bruce, do you have any other things you'd like to add?
We do have this, where we looked at the weather to kind of, the temperatures to try to, talk about, wizard global warming. And so I'm going to pull that screenshot up here.
We actually got this data when they were looking at releasing 40 billion mosquitoes here in just in Maui. And they said that the reason why they have to release these mosquitoes was because of the infection of malaria of birds, and it was due to global warming.
So here's a chart by decade of the temperature from 1960s, 70s, 90s, right till now. And this last column here is, the mean temperature. And you can see where we're 74, 77,
yeah,
75,
no,
79.
Those are the lows, Bruce. I think it's the middle column. Just you can
Middle
go up.
column.
Middle column is the averages that we're looking at.
Right, they're the average. So you see the average is not, it's a degree warmer, a degree less, goes up and down a little bit. But certainly, by the decade, when you average everything out, that's the most important of all these things. It doesn't add up to everything. Yeah, the average, minimum, maximum, and the middle is the average. You're correct.
Yeah, we all know, and as humans, they like to go back and say what happened in the past. Geologists and all these guys like to tell you how old something is with carbon dating and all this stuff. And we believe all that because we were taught that that's science and that's what it is. But This planet's been around so much longer than man ever has, and it's always in a state of flux. It's either getting hotter or colder at any given time, at any given place. Weather patterns change, and I don't believe that you can look at, even since man's been on the planet, as a complete analysis of the history of the planet. You know what I mean? It's who are we to say? Maybe it's supposed to be frozen solid. Maybe it's supposed to be hotter than hell. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's supposed to be like the Philippines and Hawaii. Who are we to say? We don't go back far enough in the history of the planet to really, they like to prove their science and say that they know, but the more we know, the more we find out we really don't know, you know, and that's the way I look at it. I really don't think someone can come up and tell you that there's global warming, at least not at this point. You're talking about a couple degrees at best. It's not even that. And it shows, if you look at it, it goes up and down all the time. We have a whole, you know, and we have El Niños and La Niñas and all these different things, right, that affect it. And I mean, all kinds of stuff, you know. So I think the stuff you're doing with this direct analysis of the actual weather within a few days prior to the event and during and after the event, I think that's going to be a key component in kind of taking the legs out of their claims on the weather and how that's why it happened. It wasn't our fault. It was the weather's fault, which I don't buy at all. You know,
Yeah, and the weather is the key to the whole thing. So
if the weather was the problem, they could have turned the power off, and then that would have not let that happen, right? I mean, nobody wants to be without power very long, but I mean, there's options, right? I mean, if it's that bad, where it's going to cause something like this, but I know hindsight's 20/20.
Yeah,
True. Well, again, Tim, thank you so much for taking this time to share your expertise with us. Again, it's very important to us here as we really start to dig and really look at what truly happened. So many of us have so many questions, especially those who were directly affected by the fire. You know, they're just asking, like, how could this level of destruction could possibly happen? And again, part of this is to make it so that we prevent this from happening again in other areas, but yet we're seeing a lot of other similar fires in other parts of the world at this point in time. So again, I think this investigation has a lot of implications that we have to get out.
Also, see if I didn't know if you were able to obtain or you're requesting it, but the response manual for that district or that area, that's going to be huge too, because that's going to show if they were negligent in their own plan, because they have a fire plan, they have a flood plan, they have a tsunami plan, they have a high wind plan, they have an airplane crash plan, they have a toxic chemical release plan, they've got a dam breaking plan, they've got a plan for everything. So there's plans out there, and you can see if they had the right response for their plan. If they didn't, they have to justify why they didn't follow their own plan.
Excellent point, and we did request that, Tim, and hopefully we'll get that manual fairly soon.
Okay.
So
all right.
again,
I'll talk to you guys soon, I'm sure. And you guys be safe, you know, doing what you're doing is putting a target on your back, right? So be careful.
We will be careful. Thank you, Tim, and thank you again for all this great information that you just gave us.
Just so you know, if I commit suicide, I didn't commit suicide. It was Hillary.
Got it. And I think that's true for all of us here too. So.
I'm a happy guy. I don't suicide.
All right.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim.
Aloha.
Aloha.